Wow, it's a landmark episode for CXD. It's our 50th episode. I'm so pleased we made it here. Thanks for joining, guys. So what are we talking about today? Well, most organizations think their customer experience problem is about technology, process, efficiency. But increasingly, it ain't about that. It's actually about emotion. What customers feel when things go wrong, what they feel when systems change, and what they feel when no one seems to be listening to them. We all know how that feels. And right now, those emotions are getting stronger, not weaker. So in this episode, we're going to explore why emotion has become a strategic capability for customer experience and why organizations that don't take it seriously are already falling behind. My name is Oliver King. Welcome to CXD, the podcast and engine where we explore the art and science of reimagining customer experiences. So guys, today I'm joined by Lisa, Engine CEO. Now she's worked across customer experience and operations for most of her career and brings a really strong human lens through her background in positive psychology. So she's going to help us make sense of what this actually feels like for customers. Hi Lisa, welcome to the show. And because we're talking about feelings, how are you feeling today?
Thanks, Ollie. I'm feeling good. As you said, a landmark episode, 50 episodes. So it's great. I'm pleased to be here.
It's great having you here. So wanted to start this episode with a simple observation. And that's the world customers are navigating today feels very different from even a few years ago. You know, there's more complexity, more uncertainty, more is expected of people at every step of the journey. And that makes customer experience no longer about how well the service works, though it has to work well. It's about how it makes people feel while they're using it. Our argument in this episode is a strategic one. A deeper understanding of customer emotion is no longer a nice to have. It's becoming a critical capability for organizations that want to stay relevant, competitive, and commercially resilient over the next decade. Why is that?
That's because 80% of customer decisions are based on their emotions, right? So, and that decision making is often subconscious and much more than the rationale itself, right? Many decisions, like choosing between brands or making a purchase, are based on feelings rather than logic. So, if you think about the last time you bought something, when did you actually decide to buy it? And what were you feeling in that moment? So, people interpret and perceive their emotions and experiences through the lens of their emotions, right? Which shapes how they see and how they value those experiences. So when the world gets complex, that emotional layer of experience starts to really matter and matter more than ever, not less. So when you think about organizations that really understand what their customers are feeling, they can then design experiences to ensure that those experiences are memorable, they're impactful, and ultimately enables them to get ahead of that game in terms of rising expectations. They build trust, they create distinction, and they protect value. And on the flip side, those organizations that don't, even if they've got a really highly efficient, automated, or really personalized experience, they'll struggle to keep up.
So, what we're going to do here is we're going to set out what we see as five forces that we believe are reshaping customer experience and making emotion central to how value is created or indeed destroyed. And let's start with the most fundamental one, you know, the customers themselves. One of the biggest shifts we're seeing is that people seem to be arriving into experiences these days much more emotionally loaded than they were a few years ago. Why is that? Why is that happening, Lisa?
So if we think about, I think there's a couple of reasons that we see this. So I think we're just asking a lot more of customers. We're asking them to make more decisions themselves across more systems, and typically there's less guidance, right? There's been this boom of self-serve, And so if you think about what should be relatively simple tasks, let's just think about managing an account online. Um, the drive for deep personalization and flexibility is fantastic, but it comes with you as a customer having to make multiple options. Set up notifications. What settings do you want? What choices? And there's very little help often in terms of what that means. So what ends up happening for you as a customer, your cognitive load, increases. And so that's just more mental effort, right? And so that shift in responsibility onto the customer, when the expectation is they're self-serving, and things are going to be done automatically, if things go wrong, that anxiety then really increases, right? So there's that anxiety that I'm expected to be able to do this and I don't know how to do it. Uncertainties become constant, right? We're operating in a world that feels less predictable. So that makes people seek reassurance, and they react strongly when it's missing. So you think about how people now interpret silence or vague communication. So if an update's late, if rules change, or something's not explained clearly, what we see happening is customers often assume the worst. And that's not because the issue is less serious, but it's because they're operating in a context already where outcomes feel less guaranteed. So those emotions are heightened.
I mean, setting aside the uncertainty out in the world, it's really ironic, isn't it? It feels as if almost the sort of the good intention of service design around developing self-service, personalization, the way in the past we have helped to raise customers' expectations about the immediacy of communication. All those things we've done, seemingly for good, actually, unlayering this onto customer, the cognitive load, we push responsibility back onto them, etc. So it's made things tricky. That's quite ironic. Lisa, from your perspective, why is this showing up so strongly now? And what does it mean for how people, I guess, interpret experiences or behave in these moments? What's changing there?
If we go back to that point in terms of context, because I think that's really, really important. So, we've got to remember customers bring expectations that are shaped by the world that they live in, right? And the experiences we design, we've we've got to be able to meet them where they're at. And if we think about the context and the world most people are navigating, right now we're in this, we're living in an intention economy, and it really rewards high arousal emotion. So if you think about platforms and media, it competes for attention, and the fastest way they get it is narratives loaded with fear, outrage, shock, disgust, right? And this combined with the reality that we're all facing of economic pressure, job insecurity, global conflict. So that means that anxiety and uncertainty as emotions, they're really, really prevalent in just general day-to-day life. So what that does is drive behaviors in customers, particularly where they seek control. So, they want safer choices. That's about, ultimately about trusted brands. And what you see is they're operating on shorter time horizons. So they want that relief now. Um, yes, they want they want personalization, but they're suffering from the decision fatigue, right? So they want to be helped to make those decisions.
So that's that first real force that we're seeing out there. This idea of rising customer vulnerability for all the reasons we said, and this kind of emotional volatility that people have. The second one we're seeing is driven much more by things like automation and AI, reducing this human connection. And this I think is where it gets more challenging because, you know, at the same time as when, customers are arriving with, for want of a better word, less emotional bandwidth, um, organizations are, you know, removing uh, people from those journeys. We're automating more, we're pushing more self-service. Um, and often the people that people need to speak to aren't there anymore. So that means that the sort of the human buffering that's traditionally used to absorb uncertainty or explain nuance in things or to simply reassure people isn't there anymore.
When people are under pressure, um, they're not just looking for a solution, right? So they're looking for reassurance. And when there's a human present, um, naturally that reassurance comes. Um, and because often that human can sense uncertainty and so adjust their tone, explain things differently, or just simply slow that moment down. They can apply that level of emotional intelligence to manage that situation in the right way. When the human layer is removed and people are left alone, so customers are left alone to interpret what's happening, in that space, uncertainty often turns into anxiety. I'm sure you've worked, you've interacted with a service, you've sent a chat off, and there's no reply, or you've got this thing that you need to get solved now, and there is no one there to work with you. So that silence can get read as indifference, and what can feel as or a neutral message that comes back can often feel cold or dismissive. We've all been on those chats where we felt that, um, and and um and often what then happens in those moments of friction where there's confusion or there's delay or effort, um, as customers, you tend to abandon, right? And even though it might be, you wanted that service, or to complete that task, or buy that product, but that friction, when you've got that heightened anxiety, it can just be too much. So it's not that automation is wrong, because it's absolutely not. It's being aware that we're removing a lot of that emotional regulation, right? And so then we have to intentionally design that back in. The experience can feel much harder than we ever intended if we don't look for ways throughout that experience to design it back in.
And this is the challenge, isn't it, that all organizations are going to face because, you know, automation and the use of AI is coming and it's happening everywhere, and they're all wrestling with what that means. But against the backdrop we spoke earlier about, with emotional volatility, etc. Um, you know, th- there are real risks there about applying it in the wrong way. Having AI present when actually what the customer needs is a person there. So they have to think really carefully about how their services work, and ensure they aren't stripping out that human buffering that helps people, feel safe, understood, and reassured. There's a third, isn't there? There's this other layer which is around, so almost like the fragmentation of journeys now, kind of breaking that emotional continuity. Can you explain that one a little bit?
Yeah. I think I'm sorry. If you can hear some snoring, that's my dog. He's just not very well at the moment, so
You got your
I
dog
haven't
there.
I haven't managed to move him.
I've got my sickly cat here as well, wearing a
Oh.
little vest, so she's not very happy. She's on my lap. So we're all good. We're having pets on the podcast.
Right. Well, I mean, let's think about this, right? So often what we see is customer journeys when automation works. The journey often is fragmented. So customers move between channels, between teams, and and through different systems. But we got to remember, emotionally, as a human, that is one experience, right? And one continuous story. So, when tone changes, because I've been passed to the next team member, and that team member doesn't know my information, so my information gets lost and I've got to repeat myself. What can end up happening is that emotional thread breaks, and the experience stops feeling coherent, right? It starts feeling unsafe. It becomes frustrating. Even though individually each step of it is technically fine. Emotional experiences are memorable, right? The brain is wired to prioritize emotionally charged events, meaning that customers are much more likely to remember interactions that made them feel something strongly. And there's that, when there's a negative experience, unfortunately, it tends to stick. We know that when we design emotional connections into customer experiences, they have the power to really create impactful and meaningful interactions.
So just going back a moment upon something you said, I think you were saying that, we read positive emotion greatly, but actually we read negative emotion far more. It imprints much more on us. And that brings us on, I think, to the fourth force that we see, which is this idea of this sort of widening of this expectation experience gap. And we see this time and time again as journeys become much more complex, more emotionally fragile. Customers' expectations are still rising, and that they seem to be rising far faster than organizations can realistically respond to them. Um, and those expectations, they're not just rational, are they? They're also emotional expectations. Um, People sort of form a sense of how something should feel based on their best experiences elsewhere. Is that that's happening, right?
Absolutely. You know, um, Back to the point, right? Expectations um, really are laced with emotion, right? So they carry weight, because from a customer's perspective, they don't measure about the situation by what went wrong. What really matters to them is how they felt, right? So the gap feels personal. So when someone has to chase or repeat themselves or get a generic response, the signals to them is you don't value me. And that hits much harder than any operational slip will. Um, Expectations are essentially commitments in the customer's mind. So even as a brand, if you've never explicitly promised, the experience you've implied will set a standard. So if it's missed, that feels like trust was completely misplaced. Because customers essentially are emotionally invested, right? They spent time, effort, money. And so the failure in any of that service isn't just a friction and an annoyance. It's actually a moment of I shouldn't have bothered, should I? And so it creates uncertainty and loss of control. And as we touched on earlier, what that ends up doing, that emotional state then amplifies the impact way beyond the issue itself.
Yeah, and I guess as well, so the challenge that businesses face is that these expectations that are being shaped, um, are being shaped in every aspect of a customer's life. So the customer isn't comparing, you know, the experience they have with you to one of your direct competitors. They are comparing it to the best experiences they've had anywhere. You know how they've felt from the best provider of something else. So if they're used to getting clear updates, fast feedback, feeling looked after in one part of their life, that becomes their baseline, doesn't it? And when your experience falls short, even if it's working as designed, it feels careless or disappointing. There's incredible businesses out there that can show you in real time, how the service is being delivered. You can see your pizza being peddled down the street to your house. Well, if you can see that, why can't I see where the engineer is to come and, fix my X or Y? Um, so that's a really, really challenging thing. And that impacts upon trust. And I think that's the fifth force we're seeing, isn't it? About trust becoming much more fragile. Because when you kind of put all this together, you got customers arriving under pressure, you've got fewer humans that are in the system, you've got these fragmented journeys and expectations that aren't being met. It starts to affect something much deeper than satisfaction. It starts to affect trust, which in itself is a fundamental human emotion.
Absolutely. Um, it really does. And the one thing we know, trust isn't built in one big moment, right? Um, it's built through lots of small emotional signals over time. I love the phrase, trust is built in drops and lost in buckets. So when brands consistently can make people feel seen and respected, what they do is they create a loyalty, right? Um, where feelings are created of powerlessness, unfairness, or disrespect, they're creating that opposition, right? And so the key really is through the experience. What are those drops that will build trust over that experience over time, to ultimately then build a hugely loyal customer.
It feels like, doesn't it, that if there's one emotion um, that every business should be focusing on, it is about trust, and that comes through the expectations you're setting, the consistency of your service, keeping those promises, um, and that becomes then critical to understand how you can measure and record and track that trust, which is something we'll come on to talk about in other episodes.
I mean, that uncertainty, right? The world in which we're operating is the only certainty is it's uncertain, and so when you think about it from that's why trust is so important, right? There's a real opportunity, I think, for brands to create, some stability, some certainty, and build that level of trust through their experience.
If trust is really critical, what advice might you give to an organization now to begin to focus in on that? Are there any obvious quick wins around building trust?
So I mean, the biggest thing when it comes to trust it is a right. You go right back to expectations. So, what expectations are you setting, and are you delivering against those? Right. I would be thinking about getting really clear about what expectations do our customers have of us, and how good are we at meeting those expectations right now? That'd be the very first thing. And as I touched on earlier, um, as a brand, you don't have to be explicit to set an expectation. Often it's implied, and that might be through your marketing, through your communications, etc. And so the best place to start is to talk to your customers and really get to understand from their perspective what it is they think you as a brand are promising, what expectations as a brand are you setting, and most importantly, how well are you at meeting them?
Exactly, because there's a real danger, isn't there, about sort of over promising and under delivering, and particularly in the competitive marketplace, it's quite easy to kind of be tempted to go with claims about your product or your service that lead to inflated expectations, and that's a real problem. Um, so that's a sort of thread, isn't it, that runs through all five of these forces that we've talked about. We know that customers are arriving, much more emotionally loaded than they've ever done before. We're removing people from journeys through automation. That experiences are fragmented. Expectations keep rising, and over time, as a result of this, trust becomes more fragile and harder to win and keep. And that's really, isn't it, why you know customer experience is no longer just an operational discipline. It becomes an emotional one, and it raises really practical challenges for leaders. If emotion is now shaping behavior, value, loyalty so directly, then relying on traditional customer experience metrics, CSAT, NPS, etc., perhaps that's no longer enough. They tell us what happened, but not why it happened. They surface the outcome of something. They don't really surface the cause. Um, so, I mean, the question kind of becomes, doesn't it? How do you actually see what customers are feeling, at scale across all your journeys, with enough rigor to guide those real strategic and commercial decisions?
Absolutely. And how intensely are they feeling them, right? Because the intensity is the important part in terms of where do you prioritize your effort, right? Um, so if it, for example, in your experience, what you see is, your customers, the intensity of a particular emotion at one point is extremely high, and that is causing customers to not renew policies or remain a customer, then that's where you should be focusing your effort.
So next episode, we're going to be looking at this idea of return on emotion. We're going to look at how emotional analytics through platforms like Adoreboard turn emotion into measurable intelligence and connects it directly to loyalty, cost, risk, and revenue. That's where we're going in the next episode. So please like and share CXD. Lisa, thank you so much. It was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, great. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
And we'll see you back here soon. All the best. Bye-bye.